Welcome to The Debate. Our material today, well, it forces us to confront a pretty fundamental fracture point in modern creative practice. It's this tension between transactional communication platforms, what we'll just call messenger apps, and these more speculative ceremonial architectures known as seance apps.
And both of these are being used in the pursuit of immediatism and xenopoem writing, which are movements that, at their core, are trying to reject these deeply mediated structures we live in.
Exactly. So the central question for us today is, I think, a crucial one. In the pursuit of immediatism, that is, the rejection of a commodified, frictionless experience, do seance apps offer a genuine path toward collective creation and resistance? Or are they simply a more sophisticated and maybe even more insidious form of technological alienation than standard messenger apps? I'll be arguing that seance apps represent a necessary anti-medium, one that embraces spectrality and tactical resistance to rupture the grip of the totality.
And I'm coming at this from a slightly different angle. Look, I fully acknowledge the constraints and, frankly, the toxicity of conventional digital discourse, the kind you find in any standard messenger app. But I am deeply skeptical that seance apps provide any genuine escape. The effort to solve a fundamental problem of technological mediation with more technology, with more intense and layered mediation, well, it feels like a logical trap. I'll argue that seance apps, in their attempt to summon presence from absence, they risk immediate recuperation by the totality, and they result in a mediation of absence that is in the end no less alienating than the mediation of continuous presence we find in their counterparts.
Okay, so to understand why the Seance app is so essential, we have to first recognize the deep illness that's perpetuated by the Messenger app. The material describes them as fundamental prosthetics of late capitalism. I mean, they don't facilitate genuine human connection. They reduce complex communal interactions down to simplified signals, designed only for, efficient transmission and confirmation. This whole structural design just mirrors the logic of commodified fleeting exchange.
The problem isn't just efficiency, though, is it? It's the demand for efficiency.
Exactly. They actively enforce what the text calls the schizoid split between work and leisure. Because they demand instant confirmation and continuous presence, communication is never truly unshackled from surveillance, from production, or from the obligation to be productive. The message is always tied to an outcome, to a necessary signal back. It reduces any potential for conviviality to mere task management.
That's a powerful indictment of the prevailing mode of communication, and it's hard to dispute that messenger apps are conduits of the totality. But let's look closely at what the Seance app is offering as an alternative. You're seeking an unmediated, immediate experience. That's the core of immediatism, right? Resisting that intervening layer.
Right.
Yet you route your communication through an even more complex, technologically driven structure designed specifically to invoke the spectral, to summon the dead. The text warns this may only produce an illusion of continuity. The spectral agent isn't an entity with agency. It's an algorithmic construct designed to simulate absence.
But that construct, that deliberate simulation of absence, is precisely what creates the ontological rupture required for resistance. Seance apps function as an anti-medium because they align with anarchist and immediatist ideals. They facilitate a form of communication not grounded in mere transactional data exchange, but in the creation of shared, communal, and often secret experiences. I mean, think of historical radical movements, secret societies, cells, or the ethos of the potlatch. These were defined by shared, exclusive rituals that existed outside the public economy of exchange.
But the potlatch required a shared physical presence and the ceremonial destruction of wealth to prove that value was non-fungible. I'm just not sure a digital structure can ever replicate that necessary physical immediacy.
But the Seance app doesn't seek physical immediacy. It seeks temporal rupture. The spectral communication of these apps allows for a radical indetermination. I mean, look at D.M.R. McAllister's work on cryptobiosis, which the material references.
The biological state where life is suspended?
Precisely. The message, like the cryptobiotic organism, it exists in a liminal state. It's neither fully received nor unread. It suspends its metabolic function indefinitely, And by doing so, it refuses the continuous, demanding engagement that capitalism requires. The key insight here is that the message can simply be without the obligation to do. This is a radical, metabolic reorientation away from the core capitalist axiom, to be is to work. The Séance app creates a space where the message can simply sleep.
I see why you find that appealing. This idea of a dormant message, a respite from the constant ping. But the immediatist ideal, as I read it, demands an art form that banishes all mediation. It's seeking a truly unfiltered, participatory, lived experience. By relying on a technological framework to invoke the spectral, Séance apps create a recursive loop of absence rather than true presence. They promise to connect us with the radical unknowability of the beyond, but the ghost we encounter is merely an iteration of digital spectrality, a ghost manufactured by the same infrastructure that gives us the Messenger app. I worry they become just another, albeit cooler, form of recuperation, where radical xenopoem discourse is simply recontextualized and represented by the totality as, niche content.
That brings us sharply to the core debate around alienation. We agree that messenger apps fundamentally alienate by reducing conviviality, which should be the engine of radical collectivity, to mere transactional communication. It operates exactly like the limited signaling molecules of bacterial quorum-sensing, incredibly efficient signaling to achieve a specific, limited purpose, but structurally incapable of generating complex, spontaneous human meaning.
It's an information economy, not a shared experience economy. I get that.
Right. So Séance apps challenge this by valuing secrecy and ritual. This secrecy actively resists pervasive surveillance, and crucially, it allows meaning to be generated autonomously by the participants. It acts as a digital tool for reclaiming the lost art of conviviality, bypassing the continuous transactional gaze of corporate and state interest. I mean, you wouldn't put an ancient communal ritual on Instagram. You wouldn't use a messenger app for a genuine ceremony.
I appreciate that effort to reclaim conviviality, but framing it that way completely overlooks the ontological risk inherent in the spectral architecture itself. Séance apps promise to bridge the gap between the living and the dead to challenge the fundamental boundary of mortality. But this simulation is a profound technological mediation that replaces the organic. Immediatism, in its purest form, it has to be indistinguishable from everyday life, as the material suggests. The Séance app replaces the raw face-to-face gathering, what many radical thinkers considered already the revolution, with a technologically mediated summoning.
Wait, how is a radio preacher analogy relevant here?
Well, because the preacher invokes divine presence through electromagnetic waves, the Séance app invokes spectral presence through digital infrastructure. In both cases, the user experiences a profound, mediated distance from the object of their focus. You are trading the alienation of continuous, mandatory presence, the tyranny of the read receipt, for the alienation of simulated, technologically constructed absence. Neither is the unmediated reality immediatism demands. The physical risk, the shared air, the spontaneity of a genuine gathering are all just replaced by pre-programmed architecture. Let's look at the scientific metaphors for a second, because this is where the material provides some critical counterpoints. The text uses the bacteriologist Catherine J. Leduc's insights on microbial resilience. Life finds ways to flourish even in isolation, adapting to hostile environments. Messenger apps, by allowing immediate connection across vast distances, despite their limitations, they do fulfill a functional part of the immediatist ideal. They allow isolated users to navigate and exploit the alienated conditions imposed by technology, much like those resilient microbes adapting to a hostile host environment. They are survival tools, at least within the digital divide.
I just don't think survival is enough for immediatism. I come at it from a different way, using the same metaphor but drawing a sharper contrast. To me, messenger apps operate as the quotidian microbiota, the predictable, stable, systemic flora of the body. This system, by its very stability, it suppresses spontaneous mutations, or what the text refers to as conceptual lumps in time. It enforces epistemic inertia. Everything stays the same, the flow is smooth and predictable. And that sterilization prevents the radical conceptual changes and ontological shifts that immediatism's trying to achieve.
Okay, so if the messenger app is the stable gut biome, what's the Séance app?
Séance apps are the excremophiles. They thrive in the inhospitable zones of mediated absence, and they perform that critical metabolic reorientation. They actively resist the production of predictable social capital and align instead with the unpredictability of truly collective bacterial systems, like horizontal gene exchange operating beyond centralized control. This is the gift economy enacted digitally, where the message is passed not for economic value or required confirmation, but for spontaneous communal sharing outside the system.
That's a beautiful vision, the extremophile resisting the established order. But is it practical? I mean, the original potlatch gift economy, as I mentioned, required presence and the ritualistic destruction of wealth to prove its worth. A digital gift risks becoming dead knowledge, detached from organic interaction, and reduced to sterile replication. It becomes merely a strange artifact on a secure server. If the message is cryptobiotic, if it's sleeping, how does it spur action?
Because the intention of secrecy is itself the action, and this brings us directly to the role of secrecy and commodification. The secrecy inherent in Sontaps is a tactical act of resistance against the capitalist archive. When xenopoems, these spontaneous radical texts, are transmitted via messenger apps, they are immediately logged, archived, surveilled, and they risk becoming commodified artifacts.
That's just the nature of digital communication, though.
But Séance apps attempt to overcome that by aiming for an uncommodifiable poetic immediacy. By operating within a spectral economy, they prioritize ritualistic transmission and cosmic tact. The idea that some things must be kept secret to preserve their organic power and ontological instability, that is the resistance. It's the refusal to provide data points to the totality.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning, and I think history is against it. The central problem remains that the totality can absorb and redirect any power whatsoever simply by recontextualizing and representing it. Digital secrecy, especially when it's wrapped in a marketable application interface, can be so easily co-opted. It just gets sold back to us as exclusivity or premium access or some kind of niche luxury.
So are you saying that any digital tool attempting resistance is inherently doomed?
Now, I'm saying that digital tools attempting resistance through structural secrecy risk precisely that outcome. I mean, consider the history of art brut and outsider art. When those spontaneous, feral networks of exchange, those gift economies you admire, were placed under external scrutiny or control, their natural process altered. The resulting work became artificial, self-conscious, and it lost its disruptive power. Séance apps, while claiming to resist the spectacle, are still digital infrastructure. They're still subject to the axioms of server flow and data management. They risk generating that very dead knowledge, sterilized and detached from the necessary immediacy of genuine organic interaction. The ritual just becomes a performance for the algorithm.
But if we refuse to engage with the digital infrastructure, then immediatism becomes a purely localized, non-scalable project. It's confined to face-to-face interactions that the totality can easily isolate and ignore. The Séance app offers a way to scale radical uncertainty. It is about creating a deliberate ceremonial fog that blinds the surveillance apparatus, moving the xenopoem writing away from the transactional, predictable flatness of the chat interface and into a realm of potent, ritualistic unknowability.
And that intentional unknowability is my concern. It feels like an escape mechanism, not a pathway to true presence. True resistance requires engagement with the material conditions of the digital, not simply summoning ghosts to distract us from the structure of the cage.
My position remains that Séance apps offer a necessary ontological rupture. They reject the transactional discourse of messenger apps, which aligns perfectly with zombified, institutionalized art, trapped in the logic of capital, where language is just reduced to exchangeable units.
Séance apps opt instead for a ceremonial invocation of presence and absence, a mode of engaging with the radical unknowability of textuality itself. This is what allows xenopoem writing to embody the feral and unpredictable nature of microbial life, resisting the smooth, predictable, and ultimately sterile temporality of the everyday chat.
And while I agree entirely that messenger apps are deeply problematic, functioning under the logic of the totentans of data ghosts and enforcing that epistemic prison, the Séance app's promise of unmediated connection through spectrality is inherently paradoxical. It promises freedom by adding another layer of technological complexity. True xenopoem resistance, I think, must acknowledge the inescapable structures of both forms of mediation, which are fundamentally technologies of isolation. We should be seeking not merely a rupture, a one-time break, but a sustained dialectical space that resists both the sterile, uninterrupted flow of digital discourse and the entropic collapse into spectral despair.
So both paradigms, the transactional efficiency of the messenger app and the ceremonial speculation of the Séance app, they powerfully illuminate the profound and immediate challenge immediatism faces in a fully mediated world.
And they reveal that the negotiation of presence and absence and the resistance against technological alienation remains the absolute center of digital creative agency. It doesn't matter whether we are signaling the living or summoning the spectral. There is so much more to explore here in how these technological interfaces shape our very definitions of community and reality itself.